Okay, thank you, Rob. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's quite an honor to be invited to speak to such a group. I do want to just give a little bit of background here before I get into the meat of the talk. Like Rob said, we farm in south central Nebraska. If you could put a pinpoint in the exact geographical center of the United States, the 48 contiguous states, we're just slightly north of that center, so right there in Nebraska. We have been no-tilling for over 25 years, and we're about 2/3 dry land and about 1/3 irrigated on our operation. Corn, beans, and a cereal rotation is kind of what predominates the dry land portion. We have tried to diversify that over the past years by adding other crops like rye, triticale, oats, barley, vetch, sunflowers, and buckwheat. We're still learning, but we are trying to get a little bit more diverse. The picture there, that's what we want to see our fields look like. We want to have full cover all the time. We did start, like Rob said, we had a SARE grant in 2008 that kind of helped us learn a little bit more about cover crops, and what we learned, we really liked what we saw that cover crops were doing. So in 2009, we started green cover seed, and it's grown very quickly to where this is what the facility looks like now. In 2011, that was all farm ground, so that's all been built in response to the cover crop industry. Last year, a little over a year ago, we were honored. The Soil Health Institute is putting together a series of videos and actually putting together a soil health documentary, and we were selected to be one of the featured farms on this. And so they called this the Living Soil series. So about, last October, a film crew came out, as actually Rob's daughter was the head of this film crew. They came out and they were making this soil health documentary, and we were really honored to do that. And I just want to share part of that video. So it was a beautiful October day. The film crew came out, and what they wanted to do is they wanted to have the air seeder out in the field with the combine. So we were harvesting corn, and they wanted to get the air seeder, because we do try to do that. We try to get something planted as soon as we get something harvested. So I had the guys go hook up the air seeder, and they wanted to film us leaving the yard here, so they had the drone crew out there and everything. So go ahead and roll this video here, because it's kind of cool. It's got really good high definition video. Let's. I know we had troubles running this earlier. Where's my video guy? Is he making it? Oh, there we go. So everything's going really good. You know, I'm in the big 4-wheel drive tractor. We're thinking, man, this is great. You know, we're going to be part of a soil health documentary. You know, beautiful day. So Wayne, that's for your blooper file there on the video. Now, I suspect that every one of you farmers out here have done something like that, but I doubt if many of you have it captured on high definition video like that. So that's conclusive proof that we're real farmers. And pride does sometimes goeth before a fail too, so. Anyway, that documentary should be coming out sometime next year. Hopefully that is not part of the main part of it. So what I want to try to do this morning with you is to try to describe and try to explain one of the most complex systems in the entire world, and it's this whole system of the soiled ecosystem. And I want to try to give you a big picture overview of what's going on down there. And I want to do it, and I want to take kind of a unique approach in how I do that by comparing it to something that's equally as complex, but a little bit more understandable because we live and work in it every day, and that's the economy of a country. And when I started looking at this, actually Christine Nichols and I had some conversations a number of years ago, and I kind of got this concept in my mind of what's going on in the soil really is an economy of sorts. And so I came up with this term, Carbonomics, and if you look at an economy, and you may or may not remember economics principles from high school or college when you took it, but there's 7 basic tenets of an economy. I want to just real quickly go through each one of these, and then we'll spend a little bit more time in detail explaining how each one of these affect the soil system. So first of all, in an economy, you have to have supply. You have to be producing something in order to make an economy go. And healthy economies have a high percentage of all the entities in there are producing something. And diversity is very important, and you'll hear me say that over and over again, because economies are not strong at all if they're not diverse. If you're only producing one thing, your economy is going to be very subject to fail. And secondly, not only do you have to make something or supply something, somebody has to want to buy that. So you have to have demand, supply and demand. And again, economies are strong when a high number of people in the economy are buyers, they're consumers, they're demanding things. And again, diversity is very important, because how good is your economy if everybody only wants to buy one thing? And then you have currency. Currency is what allows quick, efficient, and fair transactions and exchanges between these producers and consumers. Without an effective currency, it's hard to get supply and demand together. And it has to have different forms, and it has to flow very easily between the different forms. Capital is accumulated or stored or saved currency, and you need that for growth and stability. You're not going to be able to expand your economy very well if you don't have capital to work with. Energy and resources drive the system. It provides the base for growth and expansion, but sometimes it can be one of the more expensive parts of your system. Infrastructure allows economies to grow beyond subsistence. It allows you to do more than just feed your own family. And communication and transportation are the 2 most important infrastructures for an economy. And lastly, defense and protection. You have to have this, because in a strong economy, there are always going to be those who want to consume without producing. They want to get without giving. And so in order to protect your economy, you have to provide some defense, and that requires investments of capital. You're not going to be able to have very good defense systems if you're not willing to invest in it. So those are the 7 keys to a healthy and strong economy, and we're going to look at how those 7 components figure into our soil system, and what we can learn from that, and how we can leverage that into our bottom line. So first of all, the soil economy, it's all based on the sun. We're really harvesters of solar energy, and I know you've heard other people say that, but really the whole economy of farming is based on solar energy. But then on top of that, there's 3 main components. There's 3 main players in this economy. We obviously have the plants, but we also have the soil, and we have the animals. And when I talk about the animals, I'm not just talking about the large animals like cattle or sheep or hogs, but primarily the small soil-based animals like the microbes and the bacteria and the fungus that we'll be looking at. And those are really the key components to making this work. And so I want to go through these 7 principles, and we'll just look at how they apply. So number 1, on the supply side, plants produce carbon. Plants provide carbon for the system, and that's kind of the crux of this whole matter. Is this photosynthesis is the most important chemical formula in the world. It's kind of the basis of all life. It's the basis of all of our food. And so photosynthesis is simply carbon dioxide, which people consider a waste product in the atmosphere, right? We combine that with water, with the energy of the sun, and with the magic of chlorophyll in the plant leaves, and we get 2 really good things. Number 1, we get sugar. We all like sugar, glucose sugar, C6H12O6, and we get oxygen, which is, of course, important for all life. So that's really what plants are bringing to the economy, is they are producing carbon for the entire system. The soil is providing many of the nutrients. Now, the chart here shows a lot of the major nutrients that plants need. You can ignore nitrogen. We'll talk about that later. That's not coming from the soil. But all of the mineral nutrients are coming from the soil, from the parent material of the soil. It also provides a habitat for roots and for the biology. It's the house that both the plants and the biology live in. And then it also provides water storage, which is very important. And especially it becomes increasingly important as you move into more arid areas, and the better your soil is, the more water that you can store. And the biology, it has some very important functions. It provides nutrients through fixation, but it also provides nutrients through cycling and availability, and we'll look at that here in a little more detail. But it also provides a lot of the defense and the protection for the whole system. And again, we'll look at those in detail here in a little bit. On the demand side, so that's what everybody is providing for the system. What do they want? Well, plants, obviously, we're farmers. We know that plants need nutrients and water, but they also need services like protection and support. The soil needs carbon. Soil without carbon will not function well at all. So soil needs carbon, but it also needs services like protection, because the soil is an amazing thing, but it cannot protect itself. Like Rob was showing up here, it is subject to water and wind erosion if it's not protected. So it has to contract out its protection with other parts of the economy. And then the biology, those are living organisms just like you and I, so they need basic needs like food and habitat. And if you give them food and you give them a place to live, they're going to work pretty cheap for you, and they're going to be pretty happy, and they're going to do pretty amazing things. So in a human economy, in our United States economy, one of the leading indicators that we have a really strong, robust economy is when you have low unemployment rates, when everybody's working and contributing to the system. And it's the same way in a soil system. When we have all of the functions, when we have the biology, when we have the plants, when we have the soil all working together, we have a very strong economy. And again, diversity is important. If we just have one type of plant, if we just have one type of biology, we're going to be subject to economic crashes when something changes. So we want to get everybody involved, but unfortunately what we've done over the years with the industrial ag model, and I say this like we're not doing it, but we still are, we're guilty of this too. What we end up doing is we introduce a welfare system within the economy. And of course, welfare is when you give stuff to other people because they don't have it themselves or they can't provide it themselves. And when we externally provide the plant with everything that it needs from the outside, and primarily fertility and crop protection inputs, when we provide that from the outside, we weaken the economy. And in essence, what we're doing is we're replacing the biology with the bottle. And that really kind of breaks the system. And when the biology is not present in our system, then the plant starts to suffer because it's not getting what it needs, the services from the biology. So then we have to step in and provide that welfare system through a jug or through a bottle. Abraham Lincoln said, "You cannot help men permanently by doing for them what they could and should do for themselves," in reference to a welfare system. Now note that he does not say you should never help people. You should. He said you can't help them permanently when you do for them what they could and should do for themselves. And I think we can apply that same thing to our soils. We're not going to help our soils permanently. We're not going to build our soils up when we're doing for it continually what the soil could and should provide for itself. And when we have the soil system working the way that God created it, when we have the plants and the soil and the biology all working together, it's a beautiful thing. And it worked very, very well before we started doing our farming. And it really worked for our grandfathers and great-grandfathers. They were doing much of this without the commercial inputs as well. So we need to make sure that we're not providing too much welfare to our agricultural system because it kind of breaks the system. Okay, currency. Currency is important because it allows goods and services to be exchanged between all the components, all of the players in an economy. And back when the currency was a cow or the beads or things like that, it was a little more awkward to make transactions. But with standardized currency like the dollar or the pound or the yen, you can exchange goods and services very quickly. In our soil economy, we have a perfect currency, and that's carbon. Thus the term Carbonomics for this talk, because carbon drives the system. Carbon is what plants are using as the currency. And the carbon is coming, the plants are producing this carbon through photosynthesis. They're pulling the CO2 out of the atmosphere and they're putting it into this sugar molecule, this glucose, and then that carbon molecule will be recombined into many, many other compounds that will be used throughout the system to purchase goods and services. And carbon is important because it does drive the system. Plants use the carbon that they make to make payments through root exudates, and we'll look at that in a little bit more detail, but they're actually making payments to the biology, and in exchange, they're getting services. They're getting sourcing, they're getting nutrients, they're getting delivery of moisture, they're getting protection from all of these biological components, but the biology doesn't work for free, you have to pay them, and the payment is through the carbon. Carbon is essential to all life. You and I are about 19% carbon. Carbon can form over 10 million different chemical compounds. It's the most important, but the most overlooked of all plant nutrients. When's the last time you sat down with your agronomist and said, we need a plan of how much carbon we're going to need for our crop? Yeah, you never talk about that. It's overlooked, but it is the most important, and it's the main food source for soil biology. And when you're short on carbon, you're going to be short on biology. When you have increased soil carbon currency, when you have more carbon in the system, it normalizes soil pH, it increases the CEC of the soil, it increases availability of most of the important nutrients, and it reduces the availability of some of the harmful ones like sodium and aluminum. So more carbon is always a good thing for your soil. It's kind of a buffering feature that is built into our soils. And it's the perfect currency because look at this. It can be collected through photosynthesis. It can be spent. In other words, it can be traded to soil organisms, just like money. It can be saved through soil organic matter, and it is desired by all members of the economy. And it has different states, just like our currency has different states. We've got the gaseous form, the CO2, and I have the credit card picture there because that's just virtually unlimited, right? We've got CO2, credit cards, you can just spend as much as you want on those, right? The liquid form of carbon is what moves up and down in the plants and through the soil, and that's kind of like cash because that's just immediate. That's the most immediate form of your currency. And then, of course, we have the solid carbon, which is in our living organisms and built into the long-term humus and organic matter, and that's kind of like a savings bond because that's more long-term, stable investments and money that you have. And carbon easily switches between the three different forms, just like you can take cash and you can pay for your credit card or you can make an investment. Currency has to be very exchangeable, and carbon is very exchangeable within our system. So it's the perfect currency. And then when you have excess currency, you can start to build up capital. And capital is just simply stored or saved currency. You cannot build a savings account if you're spending more than you earn. Okay, that's just a simple economic fact. And you cannot build up your soil organic matter, which is the capital of the soil. You can't build that up if you're burning more carbon than what you're producing. It's just a simple fact. And you need that capital for growth and stability. And the best way to measure soil carbon capital is through soil organic matter. And we could spend the whole weekend just talking about the importance of soil organic matter. We don't have time to do that. But it's extremely important to have the organic matter and the humus component there. And again, you need that to have a stable and growthy economy. If you look at a capital-rich economy like the United States of America, and you can say what you want to about our country and our economy, but unless you've traveled overseas and you see what other countries have, you don't really appreciate what we have here. But our economy is very stable, it's very productive, it's very resilient, it's very efficient because we are capital rich. And it's the same way with high organic matter soils. If you've ever broken out a piece of grass and started farming it and it's got 4, 5, 6% organic matter versus your 1 or 2 that you're typically farming, you know that farm is always going to be more productive. It's always going to be more stable. It's more resilient to drought. It's more resilient to disease and other pests. It's extremely efficient in how it produces a crop. It's just like a capital-rich economy, and that's because that organic matter is driving that system. Dr. Lal from Ohio State University says soil organic matter generates and regulates every ecosystem service that sustains life on Earth. That's a pretty bold statement. That's a pretty important thing to have. So in our economies, in our soils, in our farming systems, the goal needs to be to build up our savings account, to build up our capital by increasing our soil organic matter. Capital savings can't be increased without an excess of cash income, and organic matter can't be increased without an excess of soil carbon currency. And that's why it's so important that we use cover crops, because when you have corn or you have beans or you have wheat, that crop is producing enough carbon for its own needs. But there's nothing left over for the soil. There's no leftover for building. So when you're just growing cash crops, it's a little bit like living paycheck to paycheck. When you live paycheck to paycheck, you're getting by, and you're doing okay from the outside, it would appear, but you've got no savings, you've got no investments, you've got no margin for error. But when you can earn more than what you spend, now you can start saving that, you can start investing that. And when you have that, it's a big cushion. It's a big safety net. And it's the same way with our soils. Unless we're producing more carbon than what the crop is requiring, and we're not hauling it away in a truck, and that's the beauty of cover crops. We produce all this carbon for the soil, and we're not hauling any of it away. It's all for the soil. That's the way that we start to build organic matter. That's the way we start to build up that savings account, and that's when we really start to build in those safety nets and the resiliency within our system. Okay, enough on that. Energy and resources are, again, our economy for our plant and soil system comes from the sun. Think about how lucky we are as farmers when the energy that drives our system is free. You know, the government has not yet found a way to tax solar energy, okay? At least not coming from the sun. Now, they're probably working on it somewhere, but for right now, we have free energy for our system. Think about how important that is for what we do. And all we have to do to capture that is we have to put up solar collectors. Now for us, our solar collectors are much cheaper and much easier to install than these man-made solar panels. All we have to do is go plant seeds, and out pops these cool little solar collectors. And so we have the distinct advantage of having free energy for our system. And it's a healthy soil economy does not need significant purchased energy inputs. And we know this because we have seen these healthy ecosystems that are very, very productive without any outside inputs. And if you were to look at the energy budget of a typical farm, ours included, when you look at the energy budget of a typical farm, you would think, okay, how much did I spend on diesel fuel, how much natural gas, how much propane? But that does not include the biggest energy expense we have as farmers. The biggest energy expense we have as farmers is nitrogen fertilizer. Because nitrogen, as we'll look at here in a little bit, is a very energy-intensive process to produce and to transport and to deliver. And so when you look at the overall energy consumption on a farm, you have to look beyond diesel fuel, but you really have to look at the nitrogen component that you're putting on. And so if we want to reduce our energy that we're using on our farm, we need to look at fertilizers and just not diesel fuel. And so on the resources side, we have free energy. All we have to do is put solar collectors out to collect it. On the resource side, the number one resource that our plants need is carbon. And again, that's free too. You would think we have free resources, we have free energy, how can we not be making tons of money? Well, there's lots of ways that we can't. But carbon is free as well. We're pulling that out of the atmosphere. Hopefully someday, maybe we'll even get paid to pull some of that out because, of greenhouse gas emissions. And there's no better way to reduce those than to let cover crops pull them out and to put them into the soil. But again, that's a whole nother talk. So I'm not going to talk about carbon there anymore. But the number two resource that our plants need, that our crops need, is nitrogen. And if you look at this pie chart, right at the 12 o'clock point on that pie chart is a little tiny black line. That's the amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, 0.03 something percent. Not very much. Tiny little fraction of our atmosphere is CO2, but we get all the carbon that we need for our plants from that tiny percent. If you look at the big red part, over 3/4 of our atmosphere is nitrogen. 76.55% of our atmosphere is nitrogen, yet we spend billions and billions of dollars putting nitrogen fertilizer on our crops. Well, why is that? Well, there's good news and there's bad news, okay? The good news is that nitrogen gas is tied up in this really, really strong triple covalent bond as dinitrogen, N2. And it's good news because if it wasn't, we'd all be dead. Because there's no way that our systems could handle breathing in 76% active nitrogen. So this is a very stable, very inert molecule that we can breathe in and out, and it does nothing to our bodies. It just goes in and it goes right back out. That's good news that we're not dead. The bad news is, because it's so stable, because it's such a strong bond, plants can't use it. Just like our bodies don't interact with it, neither do plants. So plants can do nothing with the 76% nitrogen that's in the atmosphere. So it's kind of a good news, bad news thing. We're not dead, but we have to buy nitrogen. But we don't have to buy nitrogen, as we'll look at in a little bit here, but to pull that nitrogen molecule apart requires an immense amount of energy. You have to combine it with hydrogen or oxygen to make it fixed or available. And it's a very energy intensive process like I was talking about. And you have these big nitrogen factories that are taking either atmospheric nitrogen or natural gas, and they're making it into ammonia or ammonium, and it's a very energy intensive process. But there are other ways around this, okay? The way God created the system is He didn't create these industrial factories, He created biological factories for us. So look at this. Rhizophere bacteria, what plants can't do, what it takes man a lot of energy and dollars to do, these tiny, tiny little bacteria, they can do no problem. Easy. So rhizophere are a special type of bacteria that will colonize or form these nitrogen-fixing factories on the roots of legume plants, and it takes a specific type of bacteria for a specific legume plant, as you know. But they form these colonies, and then they have these nodules, which are essentially nitrogen-producing factories. And they can take the dinitrogen out of the air, somehow they pull that apart from that triple covalent bond, and they make it in a form that the plants can use. But they don't do it for free. Because as cool as rhizophere are, and they can pull that dinitrogen molecule apart, they cannot produce their own food. They are completely dependent upon the plant for its food source. And so the plant has to say, I'm willing to pay you carbon, the glucose, the sugars, the other root exudates, I'm willing to pay for the service of being able to get nitrogen. And like David Montgomery talked about yesterday, a lot of these plants are putting out as much as 30, 40, 50% of the carbon that they're producing through photosynthesis is going into the soil to pay for the goods and services that these biological organisms are providing. So you have a picture like this where you've got really robust nodules on a legume plant, and that's producing a lot of nitrogen. Because somebody said, I know I've heard someone say that if you grow like 70, 75 bushel soybeans, that requires 600 pounds of nitrogen. Think about how much money 600 pounds of nitrogen is costing you. But what's your nitrogen bill for soybeans? Zero, because these guys are doing it for you. But they're not doing it for free. The plant has to pay with carbon. But it's not just limited to legumes, and it's not just limited to rhizophere. There are other organisms out there. They're called free-living organisms because they don't have to associate with a specific legume plant. So there's organisms like Azospirillum or Zotobacters. They're not limited to legumes. They can associate with grass plants. They can associate with other plants. They are not as active of fixers of nitrogen. They may only fix 20 to 40 pounds of nitrogen, which if you're trying to grow a 200 bushel corn crop, that's not going to go very far. But if you're just growing a cover crop, or if you're growing a forage, or you've got a grass pasture, what does 40 pounds of nitrogen do to that? It makes a huge difference. It makes a huge difference to that. But they still have to associate with the plant. So they can pick and choose. They're not host specific, but they still have to have a host because, again, these things cannot produce their own food. They can't photosynthesize. They have to be connected to a plant in order to trade the nitrogen that they're fixing for the carbon that the plant is going to produce. But the interesting thing about all these guys is the Azospirillum, the Zotobacter, the Rhizophere, all of these organisms will not work if there is excess nitrogen already in the soil. And the reason that they will not work is because the plant is not willing to pay. And think about it. Would you pay for something that you can just retry it out and get for free? No, we wouldn't do that, neither would the plant. So when we over-fertilize or when we have excess nitrogen in the soil, these organisms are not going to be present. That's because if you can get a welfare handout, why would you spend money to get something? And it's the same way in our plant economy. When we over-fertilize, when we put this nitrogen on, we're not going to see these things working and being efficient. Okay, so we have carbon, we have nitrogen, and then we have all of these other mineral resources that plants need. This is kind of a nice little chart here that talks about the basic nutrients, the primary macronutrients, secondary nutrients, and the micronutrients. Most all of these are available in the soil. And I don't know if you can read this chart very well, But the basic nutrients, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, it says it's sufficient in the air. N, P, and K, it says available mostly through fertilizers, which we know is not necessarily true. And then the bottom two levels, it says available through soil, but usually not through fertilizers. And here's the thing, is most of our soil contains enough of these mineral nutrients for our plants, but the way the system was created, plants can't access them directly. It has to run through the biology. When we take biology out of the system, we see our plants show deficiencies in all of these things, and then we end up providing the welfare and having to put it on through a jug or a bottle. So there's good news though. What we need to do is we just have to employ tiny little miners to extract these nutrients from the soil. This is kind of a cool picture here from Earth and Space Science News. That little strand that's going through, this is a highly magnified piece of rock, and that little strand is a fungal hyphae that is drilling its way through solid rock, and it's extracting iron and magnesium out of that rock. Pretty cool. Here's another article from Scientific America, and I love the title of this article. It says, Mycorrhizal fungi run the largest mining operation in the world. And when you look at this is one of the neatest pictures I've ever seen. That picture on the right is a tiny little piece of feldspar. Think of it as a tiny little grain of sand. And the little channels that you see in there, they're actually voids that have been mined by mycorrhizal fungi hyphae. And what the mycorrhiza do is that they create acids that will drill through, that'll dissolve solid rock. And then they dissolve those mineral nutrients and they pull that back out, and they're just, creating little mine shafts, little tunnels in there. So they're dissolving those nutrients and pulling it out. And as you'll see in a little bit, mycorrhiza, again, just like the rhizobia, they have to be associated with the plant because they have a superpower of being able to drill through solid rock, but they can't feed themselves. They are still dependent upon a plant to provide them with the food. And we'll see how that works here in a little bit. Here. So this is a plant root. The little black dots that you see, those are the arbuscles, or kind of the command center of the fungus. That's actually inside the root. And then it pokes out through the root cell wall. These hyphae extend. It's kind of like, think of like kind of a spider web or a network, and see these hyphae extend out, and that's what will go tunnel through the feldspars, tunnel through the rocks, and it will bring back nutrients. It can also bring back water as well. In a dry time, mycorrhiza will bring water in, and then it since it's connected to the plant root, it will provide that to the plant root, and of course the plant likes this service and it's willing to pay for it. So it provides carbon to the fungus to keep it alive. The author of this article in Scientific America, Jennifer Fraser, says mycorrhiza mine the soil not only for the basic things like nitrogen, phosphorus, etc., but also the hard to come things by zinc, copper, manganese that plants need. And she goes on to say, oddly enough, many soils are rich in nutrients, but they're often locked up in a physical form, which makes them unavailable to most plants. And that's exactly what we see in our soil systems. We see these deficiencies, even though there's sufficient amounts of those nutrients in our soils, but they're locked up in a physical form that plants cannot get to. The only way that it can be made available to the plants is by going through the biology. And when we're farming in such a way that decreases our biology, or it ignores the biology, then we're back to the welfare system, because we've broken our economy and we have to provide the welfare in order to have healthy plants. Okay, infrastructure. Infrastructure is a really important part of our economy, because if we want to grow beyond just basic needs, basically providing for ourselves, we have to have infrastructure. The definition here, the dictionary says, it's basic equipment and structures that are needed for a country, region, or organization to function properly. And the two most important infrastructures that we can look at are transportation and communication. And we know these are important because if you want to bring an economy to its knees, what you have to do is you disrupt these two things. And we know that's true because a very common wartime strategy would be to bomb the transportation and communication infrastructures of the country that you're fighting. And so you will often see a country, you'll target the bridges, you'll target the roads, you'll target the airstrips, you'll target, Back in the day, it would have been the telegraph lines. Now they would try to hit internet communication center. If you can disrupt transportation and communication, you will bring an economy to its knees, no doubt about it. So as I was thinking about this, I was thinking about the transportation infrastructure of the United States. The United States is the most productive economy in the entire history of the world, and part of it is because we have a very good transportation infrastructure. Now, you may come from parts of the country where your county roads aren't so whoopee, and you're thinking, there's got to be something better than this. But as a whole, we have really good transportation infrastructure. And the backbone of it is the interstate system. Large roads that transport very efficiently large amounts of goods and services. But if you look at this map, there's a lot of area that's not all that close to an interstate. Like we're about 60 miles south of I-80 and probably 80 miles north of I-70. So there's areas where you're not right on an interstate system, so you can't take advantage of that large conduit without getting there. So then I started looking at a map of all of the major highways with the interstates underlaid with them. Now, there's very little parts of our country, there's not much of our country that has significant population areas that is not fairly close, very close to a major highway that will take you to the major interstate. And so by combining the two, you have a very efficient transportation system. And so then I thought, well, that's just like what's going on in our soil. The plant on the left has the roots, and that's like the interstate systems because it's the big roads. It can transport large amounts of goods and services very efficiently, but how much of the soil is not being touched by those big roots? A lot of it, most of it. So those roots can only access nutrients and water from what it's touching, and so it's not very efficient. It's not accessing a lot. When you put the Mycorrhizal fungi network with the roots, now it's like the highway system bringing in the goods and services, delivering them to the interstates, and then the interstate can take it back and forth. Now we have a very efficient system of transportation, not only for getting the nutrients and the water to the plant, but also for the plant to get the carbon out to feed the other organisms that it needs to do all this mining and provide the services that it needs. Here's another picture of mycorrhiza, highly magnified under a microscope. That's a root hair there with you can see the arbuscles and then the hyphae growing out from it. And mycorrhiza, it's very, very efficient at transporting phosphorus, and phosphorus is one of the most difficult nutrients to get out of the soil. That's why we have to apply so much phosphorus, even though we have phosphorus in our soil. It's because it's locked up in very secure forms and plants can't get to it, but the mycorrhiza can. But it can also bring in nitrogen and potassium and all these other things. And like I said, in dry times, it can also bring in water as well. So you can really drought-proof your crops if you have healthy mycorrhizal populations. And a soil system without mycorrhiza fungi is a lot like a farming system without railroads, rail lines, or ports. It's got huge potential, but it's severely limited. About 7 years ago, I had the privilege of going to Brazil on a no-till tour with No-Till on the Plains. And one of the areas that we went to is that large area right in the center of Brazil, Mato Grosso. And they've got huge amounts of land that they're not even farming yet. In fact, they said that they've got more land that they could bring into production in Mato Grosso alone than what the United States is currently farming in corn and soybeans together. 170, 180 million acres that they're not even farming yet. And they grow 2 crops a year over there because they have a long growing season and they get 60 to 80 inches of rain a year. So how comes those acres aren't in production? And they have these huge fields like you see here, with 30 combines running in field. What's holding them back is this. Because they're right in the middle of Brazil. Brazil has terrible transportation infrastructure. There's no railroads that go from that area out. Everything has to go to the port. It's a 3-day truck trip from Mato Grosso to the port, one way. So think about what your harvest would look like if every semi that you fill is 3 days out and 3 days back. You wouldn't be all that excited about developing new land either. That's what's holding them back, is lack of transportation infrastructure. And a lot of our soils are being held back because we don't have the right transportation infrastructure as well. And it's not just mycorrhiza fungi, it's also earthworms. You know, Rob did a good job of showing some of the functions that earthworms do, and that's exactly right. When we have earthworms, the earthworm burrows or channels, when we're not destroying them with tillage, they're extremely efficient conduits to bring massive amounts of water, massive amounts of oxygen. The worms are pulling down surface residue, the surface carbon, they're bringing it down. And also, they're responsible for the transportation of a lot of the biology throughout the system. They're kind of like the public transportation system of the soil, because as they eat some of this residue, they ingest some of the biology, and then as they move through the soil and they poop it out some other place, that's transporting the biology. So they're a very, very important part of the transportation infrastructure, and if we will allow them to develop, we'll have excellent transportation. Okay. Communication is the other part of this, and communication is happening right in that rhizosphere, the zone right around the roots is where communication and commerce is occurring. And I don't know if any of you have ever seen, observed the Chicago Board of Trade in action, but it just looks like complete chaos. I mean, it's a bunch of people standing around, you know, waving their hands at each other, yelling and shouting. It just looks like complete chaos. But it's actually, they're communicating and they're trading and there's commerce happening and they're getting things done. And that's my picture of what's going on at a little microscopic level right around the roots. And what's happening is, you know, you may be thinking, well, you know, plants are needing all these things. How does the biology know if the plant wants nitrogen, phosphorus, water, boron, manganese? How does the biology know what the plant wants? Well, the answer is, the plants will give different chemical signals. They will exude or excrete different chemical compounds, different carbon-based compounds based on what they're wanting. So if the plant needs nitrogen, it'll have one type of root exudate. If it needs phosphorus, it'll be a different one. If it wants boron, it will be a different one altogether. The biology can read those signals that the plants are giving out, and then it will return the proper root exit or the proper nutrient. Here's a picture that Jimmy Emmons here shared with me. He took this with a little ProScope camera that attaches right to your iPhone. A really cool little device for $150. We should all have one so we can take cool pictures like this. This is Jimmy was this rye, a cereal rye root that was growing through a worm channel, and so he was able to magnify it enough with this little ProScope attached to his camera. Now this is not, we don't think that this is mycorrhiza fungi. We think this is a main root with little root hairs coming off. But the cool thing about this, look at all the little droplets of moisture on those root hairs. That's the root exudates, that's the carbon compounds that are being pumped out through the root system because that plant is trying to signal the biology that it needs something. Now, Jimmy said he'd get back to me later at what those exudates were and what they're actually calling for. He's still studying that. So we don't know exactly what it's calling for, but that's how that plant is communicating with the biology, and it's pumping out, it's leaking out these carbon compounds. The biology will take that up. That's their food source, but it's also their work orders, if you will, because that's saying, hey, I need boron, I need manganese, I need water. And it's different compounds. It's exuding carbohydrates and sugars and proteins and fats and lipids and oils. These are all carbon-based, but they're all different because each one is going to signal a different type of biology and a different type of product that the plant is wanting. And the more diversity that we have, you know, when we have a multi-species cover crop mix, think of all of the different exudates that are being leaked into the soil, and each one of those is going to be better for certain types of biology. So when we have a diverse plant community above the ground, we have diverse root exudates, we have an incredibly diverse biological population below the ground. And another way that plants can communicate with each other is through these mycorrhizal networks. Mycorrhiza not only grows from one plant root out into the soil, but they can actually grow from one plant root to another plant root, and so have a conduit between plants. And scientists have actually observed the transfer of nitrogen from a legume plant to a grass plant and phosphorus from a grass plant back to the legume, actual trading between plants, Plant roots don't actually touch each other. It's the mycorrhiza that ties them together, and it allows plants to share nutrients, and we suspect maybe even water back and forth. And that's why you typically see a diverse plant community is always healthier and always more resilient than a monoculture is. Because when you have mycorrhiza that ties it all together, these plants they're much, much better at sharing their resources than what people are. They're much more generous because their survival is dependent upon each other. They're interconnected and they're interdependent. And when you have the mycorrhiza to tie them together, there's a lot of sharing of nutrients and resources back and forth. And so in this picture here, you can see that the plants can communicate through the mycorrhizal fungus. There's been some really cool experiments done where in this example, they have aphids attacking one plant on the left there, and that plant it knows it's under attack from aphids, so not only is it ramping up its own internal defense mechanisms against aphids, but it is signaling and communicating to its neighbor that it's under attack as well, so that plant can do a preemptive ramping up of its defenses. And there are two ways that it does it. It does it through the mycorrhizal root network, as you can see there, but it's also releasing these volatile chemical compounds that will float through the air, and you can smell that in plants. You know, certain plants have a certain smell, especially like when you cut them or when they're grazed or when they're under attack, they will release these perfumes, if you will, and other plants can pick that up and they can sense that their neighbor is under attack, and they can start to ramp up their defenses. There's a really good article in the Scientist magazine describing this, and again, it just shows how the plant roots are tied together. Plants also communicate through these chemical compounds that are floating through the air, and they also communicate with insects. This same article from the Scientist talks about how they communicate and interact both above and below ground, but they also communicate with insects. So when these plants produce these perfumes, not only are they communicating with other plants, but they're communicating with insects. And if you've got beneficial predatory type insects around, it will start to call them in. It's like calling in an airstrike when you're under attack. And so it's bringing in the predatory insects if you get attacked by herbivores or aphids or something that's going to try to attack the plant. Now, those don't go out for hundreds of miles. It's going to be a relatively small area before they dissipate and they can no longer be detected. So this is only effective if you've got some predatory insects somewhat close to you. And that's why the concept of planting some pollinator strips or having enough diversity in your system to where you're encouraging the growth and the habitat of these predatory insects is very, very important to the plant ecosystem. Again, it's the whole system working together, and then when we don't have that, our plants suffer, and then we have to step in with the welfare. But when we do have it, we don't have to provide the welfare. Okay, the last part is defense and protection. The plant soil economy needs to be protected from many things. You know, water is a great thing, and we have to have water in order to grow plants and crops. But too much or too little can be a bad thing. You've all seen pictures of the raindrop impact and how explosive that can be and how that can blow our soil particles apart. You all know what a drought can do, wind erosion. You've seen pictures from the Dust Bowl. We know that we need to protect from the extremes, from the water, from the wind, from the heat, from the cold. We've got compaction issues. We've got weed issues. There's insects. There's diseases. There's all sorts of things that want to attack our economy. And remember, it's being attacked by things that want to consume without producing. We have to defend against those things. And you can't have an effective defense if you don't have capital investments that you can use, that you can spend to do this. So there's 5 types of defense that this economy uses to protect itself. And the first line of defense is pretty simple. It's just simply keeping the soil covered. That whole concept of soil armor that's been talked about over and over again. Rolf Derpsch, who's kind of one of the grandfathers of the no-till movement, particularly in South America. Rolf was actually our tour guide when we went on that tour down in Brazil. But I love this quote that he has. He says, "Almost all advantages of the no-till system come from the permanent cover of the soil, and only a few of the advantages come from not physically tilling the soil. Always aim at full soil cover." So in essence, what he's saying is that the destructive mechanism of tillage has as much to do with removing the residue and exposing the soil as it does with the physical breakdown of the soil structure. When you have the soil covered, you're going to be protected from the water erosion, from the wind erosion. You're going to be protected from the extremes of both heat and cold. You're going to be protected from so many diseases because you don't have the splattering of soil-borne pathogens up on the plant. There's so many benefits that come from having the soil covered that's the first line of defense. And it's one of the easiest ones that we can do. And again, that's where cover crops come into play, particularly if you're in a corn-soybean rotation. Soybeans do not leave very much ground cover, and it does not last very long because it breaks down because it has a low carbon to nitrogen ratio. So it's just extremely imperative that you get a cover crop in after the soybeans to help recover that ground for the next year's crop. Second line of defense is this whole area of plant signaling, plant communication. We've already talked about that, so I'm not going to go through it again, but I wanted to stress the point that it's not only communication, but the communication leads to defense strategies. And it's the calling in of insects in order to fight off an aphid attack. But it's also plants can produce chemical compounds within themselves that make their leaf tissue taste bitter to certain insects. And a lot of the medicines that we get come from plants being able to do that. Caffeine is a plant defense mechanism because it will exert this caffeine to ward off insects. Then we drink it and think it's great, but it's actually a defense mechanism for a plant. So plants can protect themselves, and one of the ways they do it is through signaling and communication with each other. A third line of defense is simply having really healthy plants. This is a slide that Willie Durham showed we had a soil health conference in Texas a couple weeks ago. And he showed this slide, and I really, really like it. I don't understand it, but I really like it. A lot of what Willie says I don't understand because it's kind of over my head. But the point he is making here is that as your soil gets healthier and it's producing healthier plants, you produce more and more complex chemical compounds, both within the plant tissue and also going out through the root exudates. So it starts out with successful photosynthesis, then you get these complete proteins, and then the plant's going to produce fats, lipids, and oils. And kind of that top level of the pyramid is these plant secondary metabolites. And what's really important here is that as you move up on that pyramid, the plant becomes more and more protected. And I don't know how well you can read that, but off on the side, when you're producing these complete proteins and the fats and lipids, it says you get resistance to downy mildew and powdery mildew, as well as bacterial invaders like fire blight, scab, rust, and bacterial spot. The proteins will make it resistant to aphids, while flies and larval insects. So as these plants produce more and more complex carbon compounds, it becomes more and more resistant to pests and diseases. And again, I don't exactly understand how all that works, but I think a lot of the insects can only digest the simple sugars. And as you get more of the complex proteins and the fats and the lipids and the oils and these secondary metabolites, they just physically can't digest those. And it allows the plant to ward off diseases. So the best way to protect your plants is to have healthy soil that produces these healthy plants that produce these more complex chemical compounds. And you can't do that. Again, you don't have that defense mechanism if you are lacking in carbon. If you don't have that carbon reserve to feed all of the biology, to really feed the plant, you're going to be lacking in this. A fourth line of defense is symbiotic relationships between plants and other organisms, such as an endophyte fungus. This is a picture that I got from the Noble Research Institute. Some of the research they're doing with introducing novel endophytes into the roots of a grass plant. And what these do is this fungus actually, it's kind of like Mycorrhizal in that it lives inside the root and it functions with the root. But it's more of a defense mechanism. It protects against diseases and whatnot, more so than being a collector type organism. So there's some really cool things going on, both naturally and working with plant breeding to do this. And then a fifth line of defense is just simply having a lot of diversity. Diversity of plants, diversity of roots, diversity of types and seasons and insects and biology, because most things that are going to attack a system are going to be pretty specific in what they attack. And if you have a cover crop that looks like that one on the bottom there, that just kind of looks like the jungle, with tall stuff and short stuff and, deep roots and shallow roots, and I've got warm season and cool season, and there's legumes and there's grasses and there's brassicas and there's broadleaves. When I have this great diversity of plants, if an insect comes in and it's primarily going to attack one type of plant, it's going to get confused as heck and go, I'm on this plant, but I don't know where the next one is. It kind of gets confused, it gets lost. So there's great power in diversity in being able to protect the system, because again, an economy that's only producing one type of thing, think of the Irish potato famine, that economy was based on potatoes. When they had a potato famine, the country was wrecked, literally wrecked for many years, because it was dependent upon one single entity. And when we're so heavily invested in corn or in soybeans or whatever you're growing, and it's not very diverse, you're very susceptible to the whims of the market. You're very susceptible to diseases and insects and other things like that. So there's kind of, in a nutshell, I know there's a lot of information in a fairly short period of time. That's how all of these economic principles apply to the soil and what's going on in the soil. And so just to summarize, I want to just give you 8 takeaway points here to kind of take home and think about, because this is how it really applies to our bottom line. Economies, whether they're the economy of a country or the economy of our soil, they're intricately interconnected and interdependent. And when you mess with one part of it, you're going to affect the other parts. It just will. And so when we mess with the biological component of our soils, through tillage, through excess fertilizer, through excess herbicides, that all messes with the biology. When we do that, it's going to affect the other parts of the economy. There's no two ways around that. So if we're going to truly rebuild our soils, we really need to focus on how we can get the biology back into the system. Number 2, we need to focus on how can we reduce the amount of welfare that we're giving our economy. We need to get everybody working. We need to put the system back the way it was created to do. Now, I don't know that let me put it this way. I know that it's possible to completely eliminate all chemical inputs because I've seen other people do it. I don't know that that's practical necessarily for our operation, may not be for your operation, but our goal shouldn't necessarily be to completely eliminate, but to reduce as much as we can and get the system working the way it was designed to work by having the animals, the biology. That's the component that we're missing the most. So what can we do to increase our soil biology so that we can decrease the amount of welfare that we give in our system? Because any economy is going to be stronger when we get people off the unemployment line and put them back to work. And that's what we need to be thinking about with our soils, is how can we put everything back to work the way it needs to be. Number 3, if you're like me, you're coming into the end of the year, the banker's calling you up and says, hey, I want to see your cash flow for next year. Okay? So try this on him. Say, I'm going to increase my cash flow this next year by planting cover crops. Now, you'll have to explain to him you're talking about your carbon currency cash flow. He may not necessarily put that on your financial statement, but actually some bankers are. They're giving some credits for soil health, which is good. But look, listen, when you're in a corn-soybean rotation, you are less than 50% efficient in collecting solar energy and producing liquid carbon. Liquid carbon is your cash flow. And you're less than 50% efficient because you've only got plants growing for half the year. And so what would it look like for the cash flow of your system? What would it look like for being able to make those investments if you go from just corn and soybeans, but go from corn to cover crop rye and maybe graze that, and then maybe put a cereal grain in the rotation and have a cover crop following that? Get more plants growing more of the time if you want to have better cash flow. And the only way that you can do that is if you have cover crops. It's the easiest way to do that for sure. And then take that excess carbon that you're producing through the cover crops and make capital investments of long-term carbon, organic matter. And again, grazing is a great way to do that if you've got that option. You can grow huge summer cover crops like this picture on the left. You know, you can get sorghum sedan to grow 10, 12 feet tall, massive amounts of carbon infusion into the system. You can have more diverse cover crops, but make those long-term investments by getting those cover crops growing, and then don't sell off the investments. And it drives me crazy when I see people doing this. They may grow this crop and then they'll come in and they think they need to vertical till it because it's too much residue, or they think they have to bale up the residue because their planter can't handle it, or because the feedlot said I'll pay you $25 a ton for that corn stalks, or whatever. When you do that, it's like you're selling off your investments. And when you sell off your investments, there's no way that you can grow into the future. There's no way that you can be more stable if you're selling off your investments. So you need to really protect against the sell-off. Number 5, take advantage of the free tiny workers. You know, these guys want to work for you. They want to work for free, and they do so many different things for us. They manufacture nitrogen. They mine all of the rock minerals. They transport things. They communicate. They help protect it. Biological diversity is so very important. And again, that's why we need to be looking at some of these insectiary pollinator type strips. We need to look at more diverse rotations, because it's all about the biological diversity in making that system healthy and work the way it was created to work. Number 6, build and do not destroy your infrastructure, and you'll really see your economy grow. Economies grow when you make investments in infrastructure. And when you allow the mycorrhizal to grow, when you encourage the earthworms, when you have all of these other organisms that help transport and communicate, you're really doing a service to your economy. And then for sure, do not come in and do this, because this is literally declaring war on your soil. Because remember, I said a wartime strategy is to disrupt and destroy the transportation infrastructure. So when you disc, think about this, when you disc or you plow, when you do tillage, you are literally declaring war on your soil. Think about that next time you want to drag that thing out. Number 7, protect your soil economy with soil armor. Keep it covered. Keep it covered. That's just, if you don't keep the soil covered, all of these other things that you can do, all the other things that we've talked about, aren't going to work well at all. And this is one of the easiest things to do, and it's really where we have to start. We have to do whatever we can to keep our soil covered so that all of these other things can work, so that we moderate the temperatures. So we're providing the protection for the soil and for the organisms. And number 8, again, just diversity is so very important for this healthy economy. Plants, roots, and soil animals. I don't know what you can do to increase the diversity on your operation. We struggle enough to figure out how to do it on our own, so I'm not here to tell you how to do it. I'm just telling you it's really important. And you need to figure out how can you bring back not only the plant diversity, but also the biological diversity. And obviously, you know, the whole conference here is about cover crops because it is the easiest and the simplest way to do it. In my talk yesterday, I talked about how it's difficult to increase the cash cropping diversity in your system, because when you introduce new cash crops into your rotation, you need specialized equipment, specialized knowledge, and specialized marketing in order to do that. Some people can do that. Dan was talking about in New Zealand how those farmers are growing 5 or 6 different cash crops. We may not be able to do that very easily because we don't have access to all that specialty stuff. With a cover crop, you don't need specialized equipment. You don't need specialized knowledge, and you don't need a specialized market to grow cover crops. The diversity that comes from cover crops is extremely simple to implement. So, I don't know how good a job I did explaining the big picture. Like I say, it's very, very complex systems. The soil system is extremely complex. The economy of a country is very, very complex, but there's a lot of parallels that go together and bring them together, and a lot of similarities. We understand economics because we live in an economy. We need to understand our soil economy, and not just dollars and cents on how much grain we're hauling to town, but the overall economy of what's happening in the soil. So I hope that helps kind of put things in a little bit of perspective. A lot of information there. I know there's a couple versions of this talk on YouTube if you want to go back and listen to it again. I know they're videotaping this and we'll make it available. So feel free to share this with others if you will. And thank you very much for your attention.